Please leave a comment where in the world you are listening from. Wendell was a panhandler near my college. I always gave him my change when I had extra. Usually I keep a hard rule not to give money to individuals because I give it to known local charities instead, where I can be sure the money is going to a specific cause. This one panhandler, though, he always sang opera music. Quite beautifully, all things considered. Even though it was clear he was begging for money due to poverty and homelessness, not busking for tips, I always thought it was admirable that he was trying to perform a service in exchange for the money. And I don't like carrying coins, so gave what I could. It wasn't much. Barely $1 each time. I would occasionally strike up conversations with Wendell, even if I didn't have any money for him. He liked to make students laugh with funny impressions or jokes. He was a bit older. I'm an undergrad. He was probably 40s or 50s. So we'd mostly have quick chats about the news or the weather or whatever. Nothing deep. Sometimes he'd randomly share something so intimate that I'd feel obligated to reciprocate with something at least superficially personal. E.g., he'd blurt out that he almost went to college on a baseball scholarship, but drugs ruined everything. I'd be like, "Oh wow, sorry to hear that. I play volleyball. Not for a scholarship though. See you around, okay?" Once Wendell called me over while I was walking with a professor/my advisor, and I didn't want to be rude. So I went over just to say a quick hello and introduce my advisor. When we walked away, my advisor was pretty clearly horrified and asked why Wendell knew me by name. I explained our little friendship. He said the homeless in this city weren't like the homeless in my smaller town back home. I figured he was being elitist, and I think he could tell I hadn't taken him seriously because after we dropped the subject, just before I left, he reiterated that I shouldn't forge friendships with the homeless population in this city, or even give them money because the chronically homeless, the ones on the streets enough that you could get to know them, tended to have criminal or addictive histories. I was surprised because my advisor is usually pretty progressive and compassionate, so I appealed to him with, Wendell is a victim of a post-capitalist society, and all the other things I'd learned in his very own classes. But he wasn't having any of it, basically saying however Wendell became chronically homeless, now he was, and I should act accordingly. So my professor strongly implored me not to continue even talking to Wendell at all. I kind of shook my head thinking, okay boomer, and if anything, felt fortified by the warning. Like it was a confirmation that I was a radical doing the right thing, leading a new path, breaking down barriers, bettering society. I got closer to Wendell and shared more about my life with him. But the very next time I talked to Wendell, he was really irritable and distant, and I wasn't sure why. Until he said, "So your boyfriend, you two live together or what?" And I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, "What boyfriend?" And he said, "The guy I met from yesterday you were walking down the street with." And I laughed, explaining it wasn't my boyfriend. It was just my academic advisor. Then all of a sudden, he wasn't irritable anymore. He was as chatty as he'd ever been. I probably should have taken that as a red flag, but I didn't think about Wendell much at all then. I only saw him once or twice a week, and only for a few minutes. It was around then that Wendell started bringing me gifts. I'd pass him, and he'd have a flower for me, or a metal machine piece. I never refused, because I figured it was a means of preserving his dignity when accepting money, like with his opera singing. One of my roommates did remark on the flower once, and when I explained, she said it was weird. I thought she was also just being elitist, and that I was enlightened, bridging the class divide, and superior to her neoliberal paranoia. I mean, come on, it was just a flower. My advisor clocked all this, so brought it up with me again a while later, saying he was worried I was being manipulated. I tried to tell him about Wendell's opera singing and impressions, and how he even almost went to college, but then I remembered the reason he lost his baseball scholarship, and I stopped short. Looking at it through that lens kind of made me reconsider the whole thing. I thought about what my professor had said, sparing the details. We did talk for like half an hour, and I finally connected the dots that Wendell did have a history of drug use, and he did sometimes mention how a previous girlfriend overreacting to something he'd done had derailed his life besides the drugs. So I decided maybe I should think about distancing myself a little. But very shortly after, the pandemic hit and classes went virtual. So to save on rent, I went home to my parents' house. Still in the state, but not near campus at all. About 3 weeks into being home, I was watching a friend's Insta story when I heard Wendell singing opera in the background, and I thought, I forgot all about him. Hope he's doing all right. And that was that. I kept watching different stories. Later that night, something about the story kind of stuck in my gut. It had popped into my mind a few times subconsciously, and I'd ignored it. but it kept coming back, so I decided to go and watch it again. That's when I realized my friend's video wasn't from our college town. It was from my much smaller hometown, which is nowhere near my college. That freaked me out a little. But I figured everyone moved around when the pandemic hit. My town isn't that small. It isn't that far from the college. It was probably a coincidence. I really wanted to mention it to my parents, but they had always warned me against talking to homeless people, besides, like, "Can I buy you a meal?" So I felt too embarrassed to explain the situation to them. Especially since it was probably a coincidence, and I would sound so conceited if I were like, "He definitely followed me, because aren't I just so great that he's probably obsessed with me?" We have a type 1 diabetic in the family, so we took quarantining very seriously. I figured I'll never see him anyways. I'm not going out anytime soon. It doesn't matter where he is. And nothing happened. Well, one thing. A girl from my high school who also ended up at my college called me and in summary said this is going to sound really weird, but I feel like I should say something. I was downtown and a beggar asked me about you. Like, specifically you. He knew you were on club volleyball. He knew your major. I didn't tell him anything, but I thought you should know. I was pretty alarmed at first, because how would he know I know this girl? But once we talked I learned she'd been wearing a sweatshirt from our college. So I thought about it and decided he probably saw that sweatshirt, figured she might know me from college since we were both from this town, and was just trying to find out how I was doing. I thought it was sweet. Also a little weird. But he was a little weird. That was part of his charm. I thanked her but told her not to worry about it. Besides, I wasn't in town much longer anyways. I had decided to go live back near campus. It was impossible to get my coursework done with my whole family around all day. So I went back to campus a while later. Didn't think about Wendell at all. Until I saw him back on the same corner, just a week after I returned to campus. Okay, even I knew at that time that something was wrong. I stopped giving him money, stopped talking to him. But I was so humiliated by how high and mighty I had been insisting that nothing was wrong and everyone else was being paranoid and elitist, that I decided not to tell anyone what I had noticed. I was already barely leaving my apartment, never going on campus, and his usual spot was right by campus. I felt bad about potentially hurting his feelings or reading too far into the situation, but I figured he'd get the message, and better safe than sorry. After finals, I decided to visit my brother. In a different state. His roommate had moved home, leaving an extra bed, so I drove up to his place to celebrate the end of the year and get away from it all. About the 9th day in, I was woken up way earlier than usual. When my brother isn't working or in school, he sleeps until noon, to the sound of my brother talking at the door. I got up to see what was going on. Because we weren't seeing anyone, we stayed totally quarantined. His state was being hit hard. My brother was talking nicely to someone outside through a crack in the door, but when he turned he looked royally pissed at me. He turned back outside and said, "Hold on here," closed the door, despite the other guy protesting, but I couldn't hear what he said exactly. My brother immediately got in my face and whisper yelling said, "Mom and Dad are gonna kill you." I had no idea what he was talking about, but my first thought was the cops had come to arrest me for something. It was the only logical thought I could generate first thing in the morning. The only thing I could imagine being arrested for was my fake ID, which I only even used to get into concerts, and obviously none lately, so I was really in shock. But my brother was still going, as best I can remember because I was panicked at this point. He was saying, "And I'm gonna kill you. This is so not cool. You didn't even ask?" I wouldn't have said yes anyways. But you didn't even think to ask. I realized that didn't align with being arrested, so finally I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "You're dating a 40-year-old guy. Older? 45 maybe? Of all the people out there, I mean Jesus. Dad's gonna kill you, and then have a heart attack and die. Which will kill Mom. And you invited him to my house while we're supposed to be social distanced? You two can go to a hotel, because he isn't coming in here. I wasn't a dick to him, out of respect for you. But if he doesn't leave now, that's gonna change." So, I had no idea what he was talking about. None. I hadn't connected any of the pieces yet. Because, you've got to remember, Wendell was such a small part of my life until this point. I almost never saw him or thought about him. My whole world had been turned upside down by a pandemic in the preceding few months. He was background noise. Faint background noise. Compared to all the other stuff I had going on. So I just said the first thing that came to mind. "Dude, I don't know why you're getting so mad at me. I don't have a boyfriend. I don't know what you're talking about. Someone's got the wrong house." My brother looked like he was ready to rip my face off. He said, "We're adults, come on, don't fucking lie to me. I'm not Mom and Dad. We can't deal with this if you're going to lie to my face. And I said I wasn't lying, and I think he could tell from my expression and tone that I genuinely was serious. So now he was as confused and irritated as I was, and he was like, he didn't just vaguely say he was here for his girlfriend. He used your name. He rattled off a ton of very exact info. I think he said you, yeah. He said you guys had a fight, and he was here to work things out. Now, I've been looking for a boyfriend for a long time, so I was half thinking, maybe dreams do come true. Might as well see who it is. But I was also starting to feel a bit sick in the pit of my stomach, because it would be one thing if this happened on campus or back home. But I had changed states. My brother moved to this state for school, and I don't know anyone here but him and his friends. So I finally did the obvious thing and looked through the peephole. I almost didn't recognize him at first because he had showered, shaved, and changed into clean clothes for the first time since I'd known him. But sure as shit, it was Wendell standing on my brother's doorstep, hundreds of miles from his original corner. I was so scared I couldn't speak. My heart was pounding like I was slipping under deep water with my legs tied. I just backed away from the door and sat down on the couch and tried to collect myself. My brother thought this was my affirming that there really was some secret older boyfriend who had just made himself known. So it took a minute for him to cut off his ranting and his dramatic, what will grandma think, stuff. Finally he realized I was tearing up and he sat down, calmed down, and apologized and said we'd figure it out. And I whispered, still out of breath, "No, you don't understand." He followed me here. My brother still didn't get it. "What? You didn't want him to come here? What was your fight about?" He asked, still thinking the guy was my boyfriend. I managed to repress my panic enough to explain the broad strokes to him. But I don't think he fully grasped how creepy it was in the moment, because he was like, "You're shitting me. That's hilarious. I'll take care of this." He went to the door and called from behind it, "Yo, just checked. She's not here. Must have packed out this morning. You should do the same. I'm taking this social distancing real serious." And winked at me. That's when, as my brother says when he tells this story, it got real. Wendell said, "You're lying. I heard her in there. Tell her I'm sorry. I don't know why she's been avoiding me, but I got cleaned up for her, and I'll take her anywhere she wants to go. Tell her that. Tell her. And don't lie. I'll know if you lie." That rubbed my brother the wrong way, and he said back, "Bro, you're not taking her anywhere. Now get off my deck before we have a problem." And Wendell sounded like he was walking away, but instead, he was going over to the window. When I saw him staring, he looked different than I'd ever seen him, even than a few seconds earlier when I'd glanced through the peephole. His clothes were clean, but they didn't fit or match. Eyes bugged out of his head, white stuff caked on the corners of his mouth I hadn't noticed at first, shaking, just kind of disconnected from reality. He started banging on the window, shouting things like, "That's my girlfriend. You can't keep her in there. You little bitch ass. Let her out, you bitch ass. Let her out. Let her out. I'm coming, baby. I'm coming." I couldn't tell if it was meant as a threat or a reassurance. I was so scared, I was too scared to run or even move. I think my brother was almost as surprised by the sudden outburst. He was rolling up his sleeves like he was preparing to go out there, and I was trying to make my voice work to beg him not to. But I was so anxious, scared, embarrassed, and sad that I had missed all the signs leading up to this, all the opportunities to prevent it, that our friendship was never the wholesome thing I thought it was. Though of course that's something I had already begun to grapple with before this day, and had so many thoughts swirling in my head, fear being chief among them. All I could do was scream. Not words, just "ah," and cover my ears to drown the whole situation out. Before my brother could charge out the door, he's an athletic guy, but I don't think he's ever actually been in a physical fight. Wendell punched through the window. Nothing actually happened when he punched through, and there was an eerie moment of silence where nobody moved. I think even I stopped screaming. But when he pulled his hand back, all hell broke loose. A fair amount of blood started spurting out when he pulled his hand back through the glass. The things he was shouting started to make even less sense, along the lines of, "Look what you did to me. This is a test. I told you I couldn't be stopped, bitch ass." And the look in his eyes got even more distant. I think the sight of the blood, which has always made my brother really squeamish, made him realize this was real, and he finally yelled, "Damn it, sis, call 911, while he leaned against the door which Wendell was now repeatedly running into, even though he was nowhere close to breaking it down. I don't even remember making the call, but apparently I did, because within 10 minutes the police arrested Wendell without resistance. He kept trying to tell them his girlfriend was trapped in the house, and he'd come all this way to save her. My poor brother was even momentarily handcuffed, and had to explain he hadn't taken me hostage. Probably one of the most haunting memories of the whole event is, as they carted Wendell away for arrest, he started singing opera music. I've learned a lot of important common sense and life lessons from this saga. But most of all, Wendell, let's not meet. Okay, I tried to submit this the first time, but it didn't get put through, so I made some edits in hopes that this one stays. Alright, here is another one from my books, a bit of backstory on it. My ex-girlfriend had a roommate I will name Lilu. Lilu always seemed a little off, but never in a threatening way. She had a rough upbringing with strict parents considering she was trans. She did suffer from depression, but nothing else to my knowledge. I would always talk and hang out with her when my girlfriend was gone, because we were both social rejects, and I know how shitty it is to be alone. So fast forward a few years later after me, and said ex had long split up. I was living with my long-term boyfriend, and hadn't heard from Lilu in forever. I assumed she was okay and healthy. One day as I went to get the mail, I got a letter from someone. No name on the envelope, it was kind of bulky. So I was curious, as I am a hermit with severe social anxiety, and don't really talk to people. Ecstatically I tear open the letter, and realize it is from Lilu. It consisted of about 5 pages, 3 explaining that she had to go into a psych ward for a while because she was severely depressed and tried to kill herself. Okay, first red flag, but I am so naive to that stuff I really just felt bad. And another page of poems which didn't surprise me because she always wrote beautiful poetry, and a $2 Canadian bill which again didn't surprise me. She always gave cool old stuff to close friends. It was actually really nice to hear from her. I searched her up on Facebook and thanked her for the letters, and we started talking more about this and that, life things mostly. When she asked to start hanging out like old times, I agreed, because she was never someone to make me uncomfortable or raise my anxiety levels. I really had no idea what was going to happen in the coming month. The first few times hanging out were great. We would drive around, smoke some cigs, listen to music, go out and eat at McDonald's, talk about literature. I actually had a blast, but since I wasn't used to being that social with anyone, but my boyfriend for the longest time, it did mentally wear me out quite fast. I couldn't keep up. I continued to talk to her on Facebook and did reject hanging out maybe 2 or 3 times, mentally worn out. Before she started getting really annoyed and short with me, she started acting possessively towards me, asking me things like if I was blowing her off for my boyfriend. I honestly figured she was just feeling hurt because she didn't really have any friends and maybe she had just grown attached to me. Things went on like this for a couple of weeks when it started getting worse really fast. If I didn't answer her right away, she would drive 45 minutes from her house to our apartment and ring the buzzer consistently until someone answered the door, and then try to bully me into hanging out with her, since she felt like she wasted gas and energy on me. This is where I started distancing myself from her, because I knew in my gut something was wrong, and I think it made her snap. This is when she started waiting for my boyfriend to leave for work before buzzing at all hours of the night. She would drive by the apartment almost daily, sending me message after message on Facebook, calling and texting my phone all the time. One time me and my boyfriend got into a verbal argument, which she had heard since she was standing outside of our window, and she called the cops telling them he was domestically abusing me, and I was deathly embarrassed trying to explain to the cops that my boyfriend didn't beat me into oblivion. Pissed off, my instinct told me that it was her, since no one else would have done something so drastic and uncalled for. After prying her for an hour, she nonchalantly told me she did in fact do it. I was pissed off, and she kept telling me she cared too much for me to let some man hurt me, that she was worried, wasn't going to put up with his shit, would kill him to ensure I was safe, etc. I felt completely violated, and this crossed the line for me. I started contemplating how to cut her out of my life, preferably without police being involved. The worst happened maybe 2 weeks later after I found out I was pregnant. Me and my boyfriend were taking a shower together. We did this to save time, water, whatever. And then our doorbell started buzzing. I was exasperated and just told my boyfriend, who was growing annoyed, to ignore it, and she would leave. She didn't. She proceeded by buzzing a neighbor and told them she lived with us in the apartment, had forgotten her keys, and needed to be let in. The neighbor unknowingly let her in. So in the shower, me and the BF are just talking when someone starts pounding on our door. Not just knocking, but pounding extremely hard, kicking, jiggling the door handle. Thank God we always bolted, chained, and locked our door. I at this point snapped. I was just so angry I jumped out of the shower, haphazardly threw a towel around myself, and whipped open the door, demanding an explanation as to what the fuck this was, and reminding Lilu that when someone doesn't answer their door, You leave not try every possible way to get into their house for an hour. Coldly she looked at me, then towards the bathroom which had the shower still running, and all she said in a low voice was, "You're showering with him?" How could you? My eyes must have widened to 1,000 suns when I responded with, "That's my boyfriend, the father of my child, who I have a relationship. It isn't any of your business. And I think you need to leave now." Her face scrunched into what looked like someone force-fed her lemons through her asshole, and she then told me she wasn't leaving, that we apparently had some sort of relationship together. Not sure where this came from. We were never sexually or romantically involved the whole time I knew her. I was coming back with her. She mentioned she didn't care how pregnant I was, she would forcefully drag me out with her. This terrified me because even though she was very feminine, she had a good 2 feet on. Mine actually did work out, and I wouldn't have stood a chance. I panicked and tried to slam the door as my boyfriend almost took our whole shower down trying to scramble out to the front door upon hearing that. She stuck her foot out to prevent the door closing and started forcing it open until she seen my boyfriend standing there huffing like a bull about to charge. Completely nude, he was too pissed off to even get a towel, which we did actually lulls about afterwards. All he had to do was look at her and tell her to get the fuck out, or he would break her ass if she wouldn't let us close the door. Lilu calmly removed her foot and said her last words to me, "You two know how to fuck with someone's head. Don't worry, you will get yours. You can't go around treating people like shit and expect nothing to happen to you. If I ever contact you again, it will be by letter," and she walked out, drove off. I was hysterical, angry, bawling, falling apart mess, trying to piece together what just happened and trying to remember if I unintentionally led her on, since I'm a sympathizer, to which my boyfriend reinforced that what happened was in no way my fault. And no, I did not lead her on, me. And my boyfriend eventually calmed down, and we haven't seen her since then. Oddly enough, I was talking to my ex a week after this happened, and she informed me that why Lilu had to go to the ward for a while was because she was diagnosed as a schizophrenic and started refusing to take her medication, which would explain the made-up relationship and stuff. So she packed all her animals into a car, doused her house in gasoline, and tried to burn herself down with it. It failed. A neighbor noticed and called the fire department, and they took her in for a while until she was stable. This happened about a year ago. I was on Grindr looking for either fun dates or new friendships. For those of you unfamiliar with Grindr, it's a social media app that is designed primarily for gay men, and many people use it to hook up with other men. One day I was scrolling, and I received a new message from a guy who we'll call Brian. I took a look at some of his profile pictures, read his bio, and decided that I was interested in him. We started messages back and forth, and he seemed to be a really kind, charismatic guy who really knew how to hold a conversation, something that is very hard to come by on the app. A few days went by, and we eventually exchanged numbers. He seemed nice enough, and I wanted to see if he was as great in person as he was over text message. So I asked him if he wanted to go on a date with me. He very happily agreed. So I scheduled a date with him. The plan was that I was going to drive to his place, pick him up, and we'd grab some lattes at my favorite local coffee shop. It was around 6 p.m., and I sent him a text message to tell him that I was leaving my house, to which he responded with a quaint, "I can't wait to meet you." I smiled at his supposed kindness. Then, in the middle of driving to his house, I received a phone call from him, so I picked up, and the conversation went mostly as follows. Me: "Hey Brian, what's up?" Brian: "Hey, quick change of plans. I'm feeling tired, and I would rather not go out. Would you be okay with staying at my place? We can watch some shows and order some takeout." Me: "That's not what I really had in mind. I like to go out and do things on the first date." Brian: "Oh, don't be such a buzzkill. Just come over. I won't show you a bad time." As he spoke on the phone, I got a really strange feeling in my gut, like something was wrong about how he talked to me. Before I met him, I imagined his voice and inflections to sound a lot more lighthearted, because the way we texted was very whimsical and fun. But over the phone, he talked as if he was in a hurry, perhaps slightly frantic. However, despite my gut feeling, I decided that I would accept his offer. Maybe he was just tired or stressed from the workday. I pulled into his driveway, and he greeted me at his door. He looked like his picture, and he was very handsome. He was wearing fashionable glasses, and his dark hair, straight hair, contrasted with his light skin. When we go inside, I was greeted by one of his roommates who was playing Dark Souls in the living room. I wanted to be polite, so I approached the roommate and introduced myself. I didn't want to come off as rude to Brian in case this date ended up going really well. While I'm talking with his roommate, Brian calls my name and beckons me to walk inside his bedroom. I politely excused myself and followed Brian into his room. When I walked inside, I saw something straight out of a fucking or/nah sleep story. Only this was real and right in front of me. There were candles lit all around, and when I got a closer look, I noticed that there were several altars scattered across the room. Effigies of ancient-looking figures, animal bones, jars with unidentifiable liquids inside, some sort of dagger next to a cat's skull. The whole shebang. I don't remember all the altars, but I do remember a couple. One of them was on the floor, and there was a glass container that held some kind of yellow liquid with animal skulls surrounding the container. Another altar was on a shelf next to his bed, and this one had a few candles surrounding some kind of doll with its eyes sewn shut and its hands missing. Now that one was creepy and super bizarre. A part of me was telling me to nope the fuck out of there immediately, but I thought that maybe I was overreacting to someone's religious choices. I didn't know much about cult religions, so I didn't want to assume that this guy had any kind of malintent. Plus, I can be a little reactive at times, so I decided to stay and go along with the ride. When we walked into his room, I wanted to calm my nerves, and because I have a really curious mind, I decided to ask Brian about what these altars were for. He told me that he'd tell me about them later. A weird response, but again I brushed it off my shoulders thinking that he might just be a bit eccentric. I can be a little weird too, so I tried to be empathetic and understanding. Then, I point to one of the altars and ask about it. He frowns at me and scowls. "Don't touch that." His voice startled me. His intense inflections paired with his angry expression sent a lump straight to my throat, and I felt threatened. I was almost 4 feet away from the altar, not even close to touching it, and yet he just yelled at me like a father yelling at his kid to stop messing around at church. I was confused, and thinking I had done something wrong, I apologized. In the blink of an eye, his scowl turned into a smile, and he kindly invited me to sit with him to watch a show. What really weirded me out was the fact that his smile looked and felt genuine. He had just gotten angry, but all of a sudden, he didn't care and served me up a really kind disposition. I was unsure of how to process what had just happened, so I just decided to sit down with him. He seemed to be acting pretty normal once this ordeal had happened, and we started to talk about ourselves. After some time, he became really sweet and soft-spoken, similar to how he was over text message, and we were able to share some stories about our lives. It was starting to feel like an actual first date, and my nerves subsided a bit. I was probably just overthinking everything else. He then turns on his TV. Now mind you, I was still a little freaked out by his random outburst, so I was on guard. So I offered to invite his roommate to come and hang out with us. Brian's roommate seemed like any old average Joe when I met him, and I just wanted someone else to be there to act as a buffer. I wanted to see how he would act around other people, but when I gave him my idea, he immediately shut me down, and his personality switched from easygoing to stressed and angry. He started cussing out his roommate to me, making it clear that he absolutely hated him. The switch was so jarring, I started to panic again. Then, he changed the subject and started to talk about me. He said that he found me really attractive, and in the process, his fingers started to graze my thighs. I needed a second to collect myself, though, so I excused myself to get some water. When I stood up, he immediately slapped my ass and told me not to take too long. I walked out, closed the door behind me, and started to make my way for the kitchen. I was hoping to chat with his roommate on the way, and see if I could ask him about Brian. But he was asleep on the living room couch, so I just made a beeline to the cabinets in search of a cup. I thought about walking out and driving home because I didn't appreciate his sudden touchiness, but I started getting paranoid. He had all those altars, and he didn't tell me what the altars were for. I've seen some horror films about the occult, and I truly had no idea what this guy was capable. Yeah, he was sweet at times, but he was showing me some really aggressive behavior. Who's to say that this guy isn't able to put some kind of voodoo curse on me? Dramatic, I know, but you can never really be sure. So I grabbed my water and cautiously head back to his room. When I walked back inside, I saw him sitting on the couch with his legs crisscrossed and his eyes closed. When I approached him, I saw his mouth moving, but I didn't hear anything coming from it. Weirded out by this, I called his name, but he didn't respond. Strange. I called his name a second time, and he opened his eyes, uncrossed his legs, and went back to watching the TV without at all addressing what he was doing. What the fuck? I was getting really worried, but I did what I could to keep my cool. I didn't want to do anything to upset him or make him lose his cool. I sat next to him on the couch, and we start talking. Once again, he was completely normal. Unnervingly normal. It's like I was in the room with a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, except Brian was able to switch between them seamlessly. I needed to do something, but what the fuck was I supposed to do? I couldn't call him out because he might lash out in some malicious way. But I also didn't want to stay because he was freaking me the hell out. I just stay, and I tried to devise some kind of plan to get out of there without making him angry. At some point, he gets up to grab his phone, and I thought I would try dishing out the same kind of ass grab that he gave to me when I went to get water. Maybe it would release the tension that I was feeling. Maybe he'd like it, and it'd make him less aggressive. Regardless, I wanted to try something. I made my move and give him a cheeky ass grab. Immediately, he turned around, swatted my hand away, and lunged at me. He had his hand curled up in a fist, and he flung it towards my face. His fist was inches away from making a connection with my right cheek, but he stopped mid-punch. In that moment, I saw that his eyes were wide open, and his facial expression was cold and emotionless. He was right in my face. My heart was beating so fast that I felt like I was seconds away from an aneurysm. He was looking directly at me, and my eyes stared back. At that moment, I felt like the prey to his predator. Then he uncurled his fist, put his icy hands on both sides of my face, and started to squeeze. "You're just so cute." He pulled me in and forced a kiss. I absolutely did not want to kiss him, but I was paralyzed and couldn't will myself to push him away. His words were patronizing, sort of like he was talking to a dog, and it felt even more like this because he had just scrunched my face against his. I felt disgusting kissing someone who had almost punched me in the face, but there was nothing I could do in that moment. Again, I didn't want to risk pissing him off. He slowly pulled away, gave me another sweet smile, and sat down, pretending that nothing had just happened. Just started staring at the TV. Yep, I'm over this, completely. His behavior was becoming more erratic and more unpredictable. His room was fucking creepy as shit. He clearly had associations with the occult, and frankly, he was scaring me. I eventually decided that I'd rather deal with the voodoo-looking altars later on than stay in his house, and have to put up with the immediate danger. So, I snapped myself out of my anxiety-induced trance, stood up, and told him that I was starting to get sick and that I wanted to go home. He got angry and tried to convince me to stay the night, but I gathered my courage and insisted that it was time for me to leave. He begrudgingly let me, but it was clear that my decision pissed him off. I didn't care anymore. I said my goodbyes and told him that I'd text him later, thinking "fuck that" to myself while doing so. I got in my car and drove home shaking and sweating. I felt relieved to get out of there, but nervous that he might try to do something. The uncertainty of it all is what truly shakes me up, but thankfully, no actual harm came to me. Who knows what would have happened if I had stayed, though. I blocked Brian's number as well as his Grindr profile, and even now, I keep my own Grindr pictures private. I haven't heard from him since, but I still fear that he's going to try and come after me somehow. Back in 2013, I was freshly single and new in town, so I made a profile on Plenty of Fish, a site and mobile app dating service. I used primarily for coffee dates, but after I started making friends, I got a little more comfortable with the idea of going out at night. I typically employed the buddy system and really never had a problem with any weirdos in person. I had been talking to this guy Dave Asterisk for about a week before we made our first plans to go out. I had invited a female coworker along, and he said that was no problem, he'd bring a friend also. However, at the last minute he said his friend was feeling anxious and couldn't be persuaded to go. I assured him my coworker wasn't looking for a date, but he understandably, at the time, declined as to no make things awkward for anyone. Without much thought, my coworker and I still went to the bar Dave had suggested. It was a popular place, sue me. I chatted with Dave for a bit more through the app before I gave him number. It seemed harmless. Now that he had my number, I felt strange that we hadn't actually met, so I suggested a coffee date. He bailed on plans twice, but continued to text me all the time. I thought nothing strange of it yet. Then I started getting texts from him at all hours of the night. Whenever I called, he would reply with a text. It just started to give me a weird vibe. At worst I thought maybe he was an unstable drug addict, so I gradually stopped chatting him as much. After all, there were other guys more able and willing to take me out, which is what I had signed up for. He caught on that he was losing my interest and asked rather boldly if I had met someone else. Not wanting to lead him on, I confirmed that I was playing the field and that I did not feel a connection with him anymore. With that sociopath, my approach wouldn't have mattered. He would have turned on me regardless. He called me a slut, said I was giving my time to the wrong guys, and accused me of only dating pretty boys. That was my aha moment. All his pictures on POF were of a really decent-looking guy who dressed well and clearly styled his hair. A pretty boy, yeah. I had been so quick to try to get out on the town that I had never asked for a Skype date or a picture for my contacts. Dave was catfishing me. I ignored his tantrum, because you can't really defend yourself against people like Dave. I stopped talking to him for good that day, but he wasn't done with me. Every day he would text me as though we were still conversing normally. All one-sided things about new books he was reading or restaurants he was trying. After I realized he was not going to quit whatever you call this, I added his number to block list and thought that would be the end of it. Nope. Asterisk a few months later, I start getting texts from a new number. Hey, just junk, how are you? What's new? Are you still single? Assuming this was a guy I may have ghosted off POF, a service I was no longer using, I tried to do the decent thing and reply. I said I wasn't really dating at the moment and apologized if I had been rude or unclear about my intention. No, it's Dave. It was pretty clear you don't want to talk to me anymore, so I'm texting you from my friend's phone. I just have a few things to get off my chest. I need closure, please. JRRR. Fine, let this guy have his piece. He went on to admit he was not the guy in the pictures. Duh. He requested a do-over, as friends. No. Why not? I humor him with a well-thought and empathetic but decisive explanation. He lashes out again, says I'm heartless and don't understand his plight. Ignore. Over the day or so he continues texting me, apologizing for his behavior, then lashing out again when he doesn't get a reply from me. Eventually, he succumbs and ends with some lament that we can't be friends. The texts stop for a while. Then one day, I'm driving on the freeway, and my phone starts going HAM. I take a quick glance, but see that it's an unknown number. I was approaching my exit, almost at my destination, and figured it can wait. Before I got out of the car, I wanted to call my friends to touch base, see who was there or if I needed to grab us a table. But I figure the unknown number may be a friend texting from someone else's phone. So I check my texts first. Just junk. Is that you in the silver Toyota Camry *** heading west on? Yeah, it's you. You look super pretty. Are you going to? Yeah, you are. I was hoping it was a practical joke, but didn't want to take the chance. I call up the friend who lives the closest, and sure enough she's already inside. The rest of the night goes off without a hitch, but I stay the night at her place to be safe. I get brave while I'm at her place, and decide to text the number back. Who is this? Dave. Now I was pissed. I called him, but as per usual, he didn't answer. I then proceeded to barrage him with novels of texts telling him how wildly inappropriate he's being, threatened to call the cops, and demand he leave me alone. Once I had said all I could, he congratulated me for clearing the slate and proposed that be friends again. I tell him to fuck off. Then nothing. The Dave days spanned about a year. I blocked his number, his friend's number, and the new number had texted me from while essentially stalking me. He never left me notes on my car or at my home, so I truly forgot about him and never saw a need to change my number. It's now 2015, and guess who's turned up texting me again? Met a guy online, talked for a day or two, but I was at the tail end of my degree and things were getting to be a lot, so I decided no dating until I was done. I let the handful of guys that seemed nice know before deleting the dating app, so they would know why I deleted it and wouldn't think I ghosted because of them. He happened to be online when I sent it and said I seemed cool. Can we keep in touch? Sure, no worries, add him on FB. Maybe once a week he's like, hey, how are you? What are you up to? Normal conversation stuff. I chat about uni, work, gym, whatever. After maybe 2 to 3 months, he's like, hey, we've been chatting for a bit, let's grab coffee. I'm like, yeah, sure, he seems nice enough. I reiterated it would be as friends, and that was fine with him. I was about to head into exams, so we made plans for in 3 weeks' time after I finished exams. He started messaging more and more regularly after making plans, more than once a day, and starts calling it a date, which people call catching up a coffee date without it meaning an actual date, but I wanted to make sure we were still on the same page. So I just said, hey, you keep calling it a date, just making sure we are clear it's just a catch up as friends. He snapped, was sending me all sorts of horrible things on FB. So I block him. I gave him my number when we made plans though, so he started calling and calling, leaving voicemails. It was late, so I put my phone on silent and went to sleep. Next morning I wake up to 37 missed calls and voicemails between 10 p.m. continuing until 4 a.m., as well as a multitude of horrible texts. Now this was 7 years ago, when you couldn't just block someone on a phone. At first I thought if I ignored him he would get bored. After about a week, he wasn't slowing down, with dozens of calls a day. I called my phone company to have him blocked. They said you can only block 3 people. Are you sure? I had to jump through all the hoops, and then they turned around and said they can't do it. I have to call the police. So I call the police, and they say I have to call the phone company, but I can make a statement of harassment in case he does something more. 3 weeks later he's still going strong, but in his texts he starts saying he's going to force me to go on a date with him. I won't have a choice, blah blah. Then he starts saying that if I won't come to him, he will come to me, and is telling me my schedule with where I will be at any given time, which he put together based on our weekly conversations about normal stuff, threatening to come to where I will be. I have to stop doing my regular activities and pretty much become a hermit. He ended up making a threat to my life. I can't remember what he said word for word, but it was essentially girls like you get what they deserve or something like that, but more clearly threatening he would be the one to make it happen. I contacted the police again, and that was enough for an RVO, and I never heard from him again. Oh, and I was 20, but his pictures looked younger, so I didn't realize online, but it turned out this guy was 34. So this wasn't dumb young kid behavior, this was a grown-ass man. I've had many other psychos since this guy, but I am very grateful phones have since allowed you to block anyone, anytime. When I was about 19, I was on all kinds of dating apps because I had low self-esteem and a real desire for connection. One day, I got a message on OkCupid from this guy we'll call Brent. Brent had a lot of shared interests with me, video games and other nerdy hobbies, and seemed like a nice enough guy, so I decided to agree to meet for a date. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him in my mind, so I just assumed it was the result of us living in a decently small city at the time. The day of our date came and I got ready, making sure I looked presentable, but not overdressed since he was taking me to Red Lobster. We were in college, so it didn't seem like that bad a choice for broke kids on a first date. When he showed up, though, he looked visibly dirty and much less well-groomed than any of his photos. Not one to judge, I wrote it off and tried to give the date a real chance. Then came strike number 2. When I went to order chicken, not being a fan of seafood, he made a big public show of frustration. He was insistent that I should have ordered seafood, since he specifically took us to a seafood restaurant. I explained I didn't like seafood, and tried to de-escalate the conversation. Obviously from then on the date was very awkward, but I was sure he felt mutually turned off, given his outburst, and assumed when it was over we would part ways pretty quickly. How wrong I was. Instead, he walked me back to my car, suddenly very invested again in trying to maintain subtle physical contact with me, and acted as if we had just had the most wonderful evening. He kept making moves to kiss me, which I somehow avoided, and eventually I managed to end the evening with a very awkward and prolonged series of goodbyes. As soon as I got home, I had many texts waiting for me. I assumed he was going to be bitter about the seafood again or something, but instead it was a very passionate profession of feelings for me. He waxed poetic about how perfect we were for one another, and how he couldn't wait for another date. I ignored his messages and went to bed, wanting to talk to my roommate in the morning about what to do. I was obviously not interested in pursuing him, but felt cruel just blocking him outright. I probably should have. It's what my roommate suggested. He began texting daily over the next couple of days, expressing how we were statistically perfect for each other, based on some quiz on the site where we had met, and he believed wholeheartedly we were logistically ideal as a match. I tried gently letting him down, but he laughed it off and said he would help me understand someday. I really should have blocked him by then, but I am very much a pushover, even more so at that age. During one such conversation about our supposedly inevitably future, he texted me that he was outside. Then, I heard knocking on my bedroom window. I absolutely panicked. I responded to ask what he was doing, and he confessed very casually that he worked at my apartment complex doing maintenance and janitorial tasks. That is where I recognized him. I realized too late. As it turns out, he had recognized me from the moment he sent his message, and told me he had always known we would be together. That's right, the date didn't turn into him stalking me. He already had been. I lost my cool and sent him a very long message full of venom and threats of what I would do if he didn't leave me alone, and it didn't work. He told me I was being silly and would come to understand soon. He told me it was inevitable and I was just being stubborn. He acted like I was denying the existence of gravity. He was so overly affectionate, and so condescending regarding my refusals. Of course, I blocked his number, but that only resulted in him coming to my window more regularly. I should have done this much sooner, but I eventually contacted my landlord. I did not contact the police, as I felt at the time it wasn't bad enough to do so. Thankfully, the talk with my landlord slowed his activity significantly, and I moved not long after. Nothing more came of it, and it's been over 10 years. We've all had bad dates, right? This is the only date I've had to date that rang every alarm bell and waved every red flag. I'll preface this by saying I don't go on many dates, but when I do I make sure I follow safety protocol by only meeting my date in public places, let either family or friends know where I'm going, and park in a populated place close by to wherever we meet. Anyway, this date initially suggested we meet at his house to watch a movie and have a few drinks, and I said no, I don't feel comfortable with that, and I only want to meet in public. He seemed okay with this, but then brought it up a few more times, and I said if money is an issue we could meet up another time or forget about it altogether. But my date backtracked and went with my idea of meeting at a cafe I chose, that I was familiar with and equidistant to where we both lived. Anyway, he turns up in a 2-door car, this detail is relevant, and goes into the cafe, and I follow behind and introduce myself. After a polite introduction, things begin to get weird. I order a Coke, and he says, "Don't you want a drink?" I was going to pop into bar, which is connected to the cafe, and get one. I say no, I'm not drinking, and he looks at me like WTF, as if I'm being unreasonable. I already explained in messages, I don't drink as I'm on medication, so having to re-explain it again pissed me off. He seems disappointed, and goes to order a cider from the bar while I get a table. Anyway, we sit down with our drinks, and date immediately goes on about going back to his place again, even though the original plan was to stay here and order food, and I already stated that was not happening. He says something along the lines of having a few drinks and eating at his place, and I said we don't have to eat, we can just have our drinks and leave. He gets defensive and says he has money but prefers it if we go back to his. I make a joke and say, "You're not a killer, are you?" And instead of laughing it off, he stares at me uncannily and says, "You don't think I would hurt you, do you?" I laugh uncomfortably and say of course not, but really I'm relieved this date won't be going any further. Date suddenly says, "Are you going to follow me in your car? Because that wouldn't make sense. How about we go in my car, but I've got packages in the front, so you'll have to squeeze in the back, and I'll drop you back off to your car after." In reality, that made less sense than me following him in my own car, and then driving home from this house after. The fact it was completely illogical made it even more creepy in my mind. Every alarm bell was going off at this point. I said, "Look, I don't want to go to yours, and your insistence is giving me the creeps." Date looks shocked, mumbles something about needing the toilet, and excuses himself from the table. A few moments later, I see him through the cafe window getting into his car and driving off. Massive bullet dodged in my opinion. Also, the fact his car didn't have back doors made it even more sinister, because imagine if something happened in the car and I couldn't escape. I grew up in a small town in Alabama. A little bit after I graduated high school, when I was 18, I started dating this guy in his early 20s from a nearby city. He was a very handsome, tall, muscular male that we'll call Sean for this story. He told me on our first date that he used to be a part of a very well-known gang in the United States. Sean explained that he'd only been a part of this gang in his younger years because he'd grown up in a bad area and hadn't really had any other options. He also did have proof of being in said gang, including being aware of gang signs associated with said gang and having tattoos associated with that gang, which I did Google to see if the tattoos and gang signs were in fact associated with said gang, since I know there are some people who like to lie about being ex-gang members and the like for some reason to seem cool. Sean didn't seem like the type to lie about that also. I gave Sean the benefit of the doubt because he didn't really give me any bad vibes. I remember he was always a gentleman to me and treated me very well. So of course, I didn't really suspect anything about him. We dated for a few weeks before the night that I found out the truth about him. I was staying over at Sean's apartment one night, and everything was seeming pretty normal. This was the first time I'd ever stayed the night at his apartment, since I do tend to be a bit cautious. So regardless of his background, it wouldn't have mattered. I just don't really like staying over at people's homes until I get to know them a bit more, and I do have an at least 3-date rule. I'd been too busy before that to really stay over at his place. So that night when I was staying over, Sean's best friend was visiting for a bit, and that's when the red flags started to show up. It did seem weird to have a friend over when the girl you are seeing is staying over for the first time. And it was revealed to me in private that Sean's friend was another ex-gang member from a well-known gang that is the enemy to the gang Sean had been a part of. Of course, I can accept people all have their backstories, but it was definitely just a weird thing to suddenly tell me out of the blue. Additionally, Sean had not even told me his friend would be at the apartment that day in the first place. An additional note, Sean's friend did corroborate that he and Sean were both ex-gang members. Then after Sean's friend had left, we were hanging out in his room, and this guy had a literal arsenal in his room. I'm not exaggerating when I say he had enough weaponry to arm a small militia. This included things like grenades, bulletproof vests, and an AK-47, or a gun similar to it, to name a few of the weapons he had in his room. Needless to say, that was the second red flag of the day. That night we were in bed together, and I can't remember what led into him revealing to me what he said in our conversation. He confessed to me that he was in fact still a part of the gang. He had told me he had said he was out of now. So of course, I was immediately giving him this look like, I'm sorry, what? Then he proceeded to go on and tell me that he actually was a hit man for the gang, and while he hadn't been active as a hit man as of late, he would still accept hits if they were given to him. The entire time he said this, he just looked me dead in the eyes with the most deadpan casual look, no feeling in his eyes, and spoke like he was talking about the weather. It was extremely creepy, and I knew right then that this guy was a straight-up sociopath. I don't doubt that he was lying. I've met people who try to get clout by lying about things like this, and he was definitely not one of those types. I did stay the rest of the night, and then left the next morning, and never talked to him again. I was definitely not going to keep on dating someone like that. There's not really anything to the story after that. He never really tried to contact me after that. I'm sure some people will probably wonder why I didn't just leave right after he told me he was a hit man. I didn't think it was a good idea to react strongly and immediately storm out of the apartment. I also didn't actually feel like he was a danger to me personally, but he definitely had the vibe of someone who had killed people. The reason why I recognize that kind of vibe is another story. He was always very polite to me, but regardless, there was no way I was going to keep dating him, no matter how hot he was. This was November 2016 in Glasgow, Scotland. I was desperate. I must admit I'd been single and alone for some time, and it was driving me crazy. That's when I met Laura. She came across as a very sweet girl and all, but she was in a hurry to meet me. So I did. She insisted we go to the pub. No fancy dates were necessary to her. I didn't mind this. At first glance, I knew I'd been swindled. She looked different from what I'd saw before, but I didn't mind. I was just happy to have a date. I'm not exactly good looking myself. I gave her a chance to redeem herself. We got talking, and after a few beers things started to get more intimate. Before I go further, she was quite an overweight girl with long dark hair, and she had eyeshadow similar to Amy Winehouse. She said she was a huge fan. I'd asked about her hobbies and interests, etc., but she asked me to talk more about myself. I told her about my job. She yawned sarcastically. Let's talk about your sex life, she said. She had slipped her foot out of her shoe and started rubbing my groin with her bare foot. Needless to say, I was aroused. So yeah, I didn't have much to say in that department. As it had been a while since I had sex, I was very honest with her. I asked about hers, and she said she has her kinks, and that she's done things that I'd never have imagined. Want to see what I can do? She said, let's go to my place. So at this point I was starting to feel very drunk, which I was amazed at, as I was only on to my 4th pint. I did have 2 shots though, and put it down to this. We'd waited for a taxi. She was holding my hand, excitedly whispering into my ear that she was going to do some things to me that I'd never experienced before. In a way, I actually couldn't wait to just sleep. My head felt heavier than the rest of my body. It was like the ground was moving beneath my feet. The rest was a blur. I couldn't even remember getting into the taxi, but I do remember falling down the stairs, and she was above me laughing at me. Come on, she said, get your sexy ass up here. I struggled up the stairs, and before I know it, from what I remember, I was in her bedroom naked. It was like I'd blacked out. I tried to sit up only to find myself tied to the bed by my arms and legs. Then she entered the room dressed in bondage gear. I was deeply aroused but confused at the same time. She performed sex acts on me before having full intercourse. I lay there delighted, don't get me wrong, but something still felt off about it all. I had dozed off for a bit, and I'd been woken up by a weird screeching sound. What you doing? I'd said as she was wrapping up my legs with cling film. Hush now, she said. This is the best bit. I was no longer tied to the bed, but I felt very numb, and couldn't move my arms and legs. She kept wrapping me up from my legs upwards. I was screaming at her to stop, and she had placed some cling film in my mouth to shut me up. I was struggling to breath at this point, and had tried my best to dislodge the ball of cling film from my mouth. Eventually I was totally wrapped from head to toe. I could barely see outside the cling film. She told me that this was my punishment for being terrible in bed, and that she has many other victims just like me all wrapped up waiting to die. She left the room, and I gave out some muffled screams. Then I felt myself slowly fading away. I woke up what was now the next day, now able to breath. This time there were people looking at me. They'd removed most of the cling film and had resuscitated me. I wasn't aware of this till they told me. It had turned out that I wasn't actually Laura's flat, but an old-fashioned hotel. The police were all over me asking me questions about what had happened. I attempted to show them her Tinder profile, but she had deleted the page. I am grateful to my rescuers that had saved me, but forever traumatized by this incident, and I end up with panic attacks when I see people that are similar to her. It took me a few years to finally trust people enough to go on dates, but I am still on the road to recovery mentally. I'm just glad that I'm still alive, but wondering if she's still out there, and if there are others like me that didn't make it. I had gotten out of an 8-year abusive relationship and met someone on a popular online dating app. To be honest, I wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to go watch a movie or have a drink with every now and then. I had 2 boys and was happy and living a peaceful life on my own after going through hell. So I meet this guy who was just a couple years older than me, and he had turned his life around. When he was younger, he used to be in gangs and drugs, and now he was into working out and staying really fit and doing family stuff. I guess you can say I felt protected by him. He was a hard worker, self-sufficient, had a son, and he loved going to the gym every day. I myself had kind of a crazy past, but overcame, and so we seemed like a good fit. We would go to dinner, movies, normal dating stuff, but he eventually wanted to spend more and more time together, and I was having trouble giving up all my free time for him, and he would get angry about this, like really angry. After being with a controlling, possessive asshole for so long, this was obviously a red flag, and after 3 months, I told him I didn't want to see him anymore. He said he needed to confess something to me. He admitted to me that he was using steroids, and that was the reason for his mood swings. He cried and said he was sure that was the reason, and was willing to stop if it meant he could have another chance, and I obliged, but only under the condition that we remain friends. Things were okay for a while. We saw each other maybe every other week, and he started wanting to see me every week, to which I told him that I was not interested in being anything other than friends at the moment, since I was not ready for a relationship. He tried to talk me into giving him another chance, but I just didn't find myself interested in him a romantic way, and so I insisted that we just be friends. I stopped talking to him because I got mad at his insistence that we still talk every day, since he said that's what friends do. He would always ask about my whereabouts and ask for pictures of who I was hanging out with, and I told him that this is not what friends do, and he just insisted that he just innocently wanted to see what I was up to. Fast forward 6 months later, and I hadn't spoken to him at all within that time. I was happy and living my life, and on one particular night when my youngest son was at his dad's, I went out to a local bar with friends. My oldest son, who was 13 at the time, was home alone, so I left a little early to make it home around 10 p.m. I lay down in bed and go to sleep. So a little info on my living situation. I had been living in my condo for almost a year now, and we lived in a great, safe community, and I would leave my patio sliding glass door open, screen closed, to get a breeze in at night, no biggie. My bedroom was close to the patio, and my son would sleep in the loft that was closest to the front door. I'm dead asleep when I suddenly feel someone slowly sit on my bed. I'm laying in bed wondering why my son would come sit on my bed so slowly. He wouldn't. I turn around, and it's not him. It's Mario, not his real name, laying down in bed next to me. I sit up and ask him how he got in. He's not answering me. He says, "I needed to talk to you." I said, "Okay. When you need to talk to someone, you don't sneak into someone's room. You call them. You leave a note for them. Literally anything but this." I'm thinking I'm gonna kill my kid for letting him in. He said, "I didn't have your number anymore. I needed to talk to you before it's too late." I didn't even entertain the "before it's too late" bit because I was livid, but something told me to keep my cool. I sit up and say, "Look, I really want to talk to you too, but not like this. Please, just leave and I promise we will talk tomorrow. Call me tomorrow." He gets up and walks over to my side of the bed and starts rubbing my shoulders and is slowly making his way to my neck. He says, "Do you really want to talk?" I look him in the eyes and say yes. I've been wanting to talk to you, but not like this. Please call me tomorrow. He stares at me while rubbing my neck and goes down to my shoulders and lets go. Says okay. This motherfucker proceeds to exit through my patio door and jumps my patio wall, which tells me that is exactly how he got in. I freak the fuck out, check on my kid. He had no idea what was going on, locked all my doors, and I don't sleep the rest of the night. The next day I text him, and I tell him that if I ever see him near me, or in my complex, I will call the police, and to never contact me again. If you're wondering why I didn't call the cops to begin with, I knew he had a gun, so I was scared of being retaliated against for being a snitch, and B, I figured if I called the cops they would probably not do much, or just let him out, and I was afraid of what he would do after the fact. Either way, he left me alone, and I didn't hear from him for years. For years later, I'm going through Facebook, and I see his face in People You May Know. I click on the picture and notice that it looks like a jail picture. You know, those pictures where the guy is clearly in a jail cell. I scroll down the page, and his most recent post is him posting his address for his family members to write to. A prison address. So I Google his name, and sure enough, articles after articles, all with the same headline: Man arrested on suspicion of killing girlfriend. About 2 years after him and I dated, he shot and killed the girl he was dating. That could have been me. And I feel like shit thinking if there was anything I could have done to stop him. Even scarier thought is that he only got 12 years for her murder. I'm 29, female, and while I'm well traveled and have been around quite a bit, I do occasionally make some pretty rookie mistakes. My fault, and I make no excuses. I try to remain diligent and alert, but I'm very capable of letting my guard down. So after being here in the US for about 2 months, I decided that I was bored sitting around my unit watching 90 Day Fiancé, so I decided to make the old dating profiles again. I made no specific intentions known about what I was interested in accomplishing, as I don't really know myself. I just wanted someone to hang out with and see where it goes naturally. I ended up matching with this one bloke who had shared interests with me. We chatted a bit over the app, and eventually I felt okay to give him my number. After talking back and forth for a couple of weeks, I agreed to a meetup. We met at a pub and have a couple of drinks. I'll admit at first I didn't recognize him because he didn't resemble his photos to the extent that I was expecting. He didn't look bad by any means, but I could tell that he used older pictures and edited them enough to where he seemed more appealing. I swear I'm not trying to sound superficial, because he was cute, just not what I was expecting. But I also think we've hit a point in social media culture where it's safe to assume that we won't see the same thing in real life as we do online, and that's okay. We did hit it off. We discussed the usual first date stuff, then we got into more detail. I told him about back home and work, and how life was different than here in the States. At one point we were talking and holding hands, and I felt comfortable enough to let him kiss me. Well, he asked me as we were leaving if I wanted to go back to his place for a cup of coffee. I told him I knew what coffee really meant, and that I didn't want to do that on a first date. He assured me it would be 1 cup of coffee, and that he would give me a lift home, so that I didn't have to call an Uber. I accepted his offer, and we walked to his apartment, which was a few blocks away. As we were going upstairs, he made a few questionable remarks. He mentioned how I wasn't like most girls because I accepted his invitation and alluded that, you never know, I could be a psychopath. He then motioned with his eyes down to my dress and inquired about my titty size. I told him again that I was sorry, but the night would not end with him getting lucky. As we got into his unit, he dismissed himself to the toilet and left me sitting on his bed. It was a studio and he didn't have a couch. As I'm sitting there and waiting for him to finish doing whatever he was actually doing, I notice in the corner by his bed that he had 2 masks. One was a cartoon-looking goat mask, and another was a cat, or maybe a tiger. What was more alarming was that he also had a Bowie knife and a small woodcutter's axe only a short distance away from them. Upon further observation, I also noticed there was a black jumper draped over a dresser. Then on his bedside table, there were a pair of latex gloves. Yawns. Okay, I don't much feel like being murdered tonight. I got up and calmly left the unit. Then I made haste down the stairs and down the street, where I was able to catch a lift. Now look, I may have just really hurt his feelings because he had no malicious intent. But if that's all that happened, then I'd prefer that over the possible alternative. All of these items alone wouldn't have been that bad. But all of these random items within a short walk from each other, I'd rather just not chance it. I do feel bad for leaving a person, but I don't feel bad about leaving what could have potentially been a dangerous situation. That along with his random personality change was enough for me to make the call that I made. As of recently, I noticed that he either blocked me from Tinder or deleted the app. During my freshman and sophomore years of college, I was extremely awkward. I had just come out as gay, I didn't have any friends, and I was just generally kind of a big wad of social anxiety. Given that I didn't even have the social skills to make a few friends, it's not surprising that I also had literally no dating experience. Miraculously, over the course of the summer after sophomore year, I just sort of grew out of the worst of my awkwardness. I lost some weight, had a lot more confidence in myself, and my self-esteem was a lot higher. I came back to school in August, and by October, I had a decent number of genuine friends and had gotten a lot more involved on campus. With my newfound confidence, I decided I'd finally download Grindr and see what it was like. For anyone who doesn't know, Grindr is a gay dating app that is primarily used for finding sex and hookups. Despite my recent improvement in the social arena, I was still extremely naive and inexperienced when it came to dating and sex. I set up my Grindr profile with a nice picture of myself and a very brief bio, and I got a lot of messages very quickly after my picture got approved. One guy who messaged me had a display name of Dad for Young, which should have been my first red flag, but I was oblivious. I should note that I look really young for my age. At the time, I was 21, but I was regularly asked by campus staff which middle or high school I was visiting from. I'm 23 now, and I still get asked if I want a kid's menu if I go to a restaurant with my parents. It's bad. So Dad for Young sends me a message that just says, "What's up?" and I reply without looking at his profile first. I then look at his profile and notice he's 54. His only profile text says, "The younger the better," and his only picture was a zoomed in blurry picture of a hairy chest, so I was very much not interested. But given my inexperience, I thought ignoring him would be horribly rude, so I kept responding. I don't totally remember what we talked about in the maybe 10 or so messages we exchanged at first, but I do remember him saying I was very cute. I know I told him I was a student, but I never mentioned which college I went to. It's important to note that I went to college in a major city, and there's a bunch of different colleges, all within like 5 miles of each other, and a few more within 10 miles of those. Sort of like Tinder, Grindr works based off of your location, but much more precisely. If you're less than a mile or two away from someone who is online, it will display the distance in feet. I noticed that Dad for Young's profile said he was 25 miles away, which I thought was kind of far. Dad for Young started getting more sexual in his chats, and asked if I wanted to meet up. I felt bad flat out denying him since he had been polite, so I told him I didn't want to meet up with him that day, but that we could keep chatting if he wanted. I figured that was that, and when I checked 20 minutes later, it said he was offline. Nope. About 30 minutes after that, I get another message from him. "Hey, my name. I got a wild hair and thought I'd take a nice drive out to my college." Smiley face. I had not told him the name of my college, nor had I told him what part of town I was in. I looked at his profile, and it now said he was 3 miles away. I started freaking out a little, and didn't reply to his message in hopes that he'd just leave me alone. It's important to note that my college had a couple of different campus chunks separated by a few miles. I lived on the upperclassmen residential campus, which was about 2 miles from the main campus where all of the other student dorms and main buildings are. I felt like if he was going to try to find me, he'd go to the main campus first, then maybe give up since not many outside people know about the separate residential campus. 5 or 6 minutes later, I get another message that says something like, "No fun if you don't play along, what building on, residential campus name. Are you in?" His profile now says he's a little over 2,500 feet away, and every time I reopened his profile, the distance would decrease. I was fully losing my shit at this point since this guy had the ability to pinpoint my location, so I shut my blinds, turned off my light, and locked my window, the door to the apartment, and my bedroom door. My roommate was also out of town on some kind of retreat, so it was just me. He kept sending me messages every minute or so saying things like, "Gonna find you," "Here I come," smiley face, and other supremely creepy shit like that. The distance was down to 310 feet, and I was completely losing my mind and didn't know what to do, so I just deleted my whole profile. Nothing else happened that night, though I was absolutely terrified he was going to come knocking on my door. Fast forward to 3 days later. I decide to re-download Grindr after doing more research and seeing that I can adjust the settings so that my exact location is not visible. When I logged on the first time with my remade profile, I adjusted some of the search filters until the results were specific enough to display Dad for Young's profile, which I promptly blocked. Later that evening, I get a message from someone with the display name Wolfindio with the same gross profile picture as Dad for Young, and my stomach sinks. He sent a flurry of messages. "You F up. Almost got police called on me 'cause of you. Couldn't find you, so I had to go to other dorms and find someone else. Said I was outside his dorm and told me to leave and he'd call the cops. I am coming for you." Freaked out, blocked him again, deleted my profile again, then deleted Grindr. I refused to re-download it or any dating apps for about a year after that, at which point I worked up the courage to try again, and have not heard from this nut job since, thank God. So, terrifying old man with a fetish for young inexperienced guys, please, let's not ever meet. I was just fresh off of a major split up when some friends of mine encouraged me to use Tinder. After witnessing my friend use it himself, I decided to give a go. What could go wrong, I thought. I spent hours on end swiping, and swiping some matched, some didn't. It was fun. And then swiped Linda and we matched. A decision I'd end up regretting. We spoke for a few weeks on and off and got to know each other. She seemed like a nice enough girl. She was a bit older than me, yet looked a whole lot younger. She wasn't fussed about going out for a meal or a cinema trip or anything traditionally romantic, so we arranged to meet up at a bar instead. At first glance, she was barely recognizable from her profile picture. She looked a lot older and had clearly gained a lot of weight. Already the first red flag was starting to show. That's not the major problem though. We got our drinks and got into some good conversations. We seemed to have a lot in common. Maybe too much. In my instincts, I had the impression that she's perhaps did some research on me somehow and was trying her best to impress me. There came a point of awkward silence. I'd thought of something to say to kind of break the silence, but she already beat me to it. "Let's talk about sex," she said. I was too stunned to get my head around at how forward and straight to the point she was. She asked me about my sex life and what stuff I'd got up to with my previous partners. We exchanged our stories. To be honest, mine didn't seem half as exciting as her dramatic ones, so I just made stuff up. I never felt comfortable talking about this to someone on a first date. It was at this point she would reveal something to me that made me sick from the pit of my stomach. She told me that me liked bondage, and that she liked to torture and abuse people just for fun. One story in particular, she told me that she had tricked a man into getting into bed with her, and how shocked he was to lie down on a bed full of thumbtacks. At this point, I was quickly slurping my drink and getting my excuses ready to leave. Then she told me her final story. She told me that only the week before meeting me, she'd met a man from Tinder, got him to take her to his own flat. She said she was well prepared and had a bag full of items in her car. Bondage tools. Then to my horror, she told me that she had wrapped him up in cling film. Over and over again from head to toe until he was almost mummified, and then just left him there on his own in the flat and abandoned him. She laughed as she impersonated his mumbles and his pleas for help. "He's probably dead by now," she said, chuckling as she sipped her drink. At this point, I'd decided to leave. There was no more point in staying. I didn't even want to question if this was a joke or not. I just got up and left. She attempted to kiss me, but I swerved out of her way. I just got up and left as soon as I could. So I'm 23, male, and live in California. Last year I decided to use Tinder for the first time. I had previously used Hot or Not and POF, but mostly just got bots and scammers, so I already wasn't very big on online dating. However, I was feeling bored on Friday afternoon, so I decided to install Tinder and just see what happened. After creating an account, I began swiping people, and it wasn't more than like a half an hour after I had gotten off the app that I got matched up with someone. For a little context, I am what you might call bisexual. Hate labels, but that is what I fall under, I suppose. And I matched with a 25-year-old dude named Aiden. Aiden was what I would call attractive, and he had similar interests in gaming and coding as I did. I decided to go and send him a message, but before I could even type a single letter, he sent me a message. The message read, "Hey, saw you're new to Tinder and thought I'd reach out to you and say hi." I said hi back, and the two of us began talking about our love for video games, movies, and coding. He told me he's a full-time coder and makes a salary only working 4 hours a day. He asked me if I'd be down to come chill with him. I then offered to have him over to my house because I was alone and he lived with his parents. He seemed very excited all of a sudden and said he'd love to come over. We agreed on him coming in an hour, so that I could tidy up my room and get my PC ready for gaming. After about an hour or so, I sent him my address and he said he was on his way. Now normally I wouldn't have invited someone to my house that I've never met, but this guy seemed harmless and he was attractive, so I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. I heard a knock at my front door and I looked out the peephole and saw it was Aiden. He had a bottle of red wine in his hand and a smile across his face. We hadn't discussed drinking wine together, but I did in fact like red wine, and the brand he had with him just so happened to be my favorite brand. I opened the door and greeted him. I told him that wine was my favorite and asked him if he's a mind reader. He laughed and said that I just strike him as a red wine kind of guy. I asked him how he planned to get home if he ended up drinking too much, and he said he Ubered to my house. We ended up having a couple glasses of wine on my back patio, just talking about life, work, and shared our coming out stories. After the wine, we went inside to play PC and had a blast. After the gaming, he showed me his laptop, which he had brought with him, and showed me his work. Eventually, I had to use the restroom, so I excused myself to pee. I then heard him approach the bathroom door and turn the knob. Because I didn't lock the door behind me, he just came right in completely unannounced, and without any warning just starts grinding on me from behind while forcefully grasping my shoulders. I shoved him off of me, and just kind of jokingly said, "That's a bit intrusive." He just smiled at me and said, "I just wanted to see how'd you react." I left the bathroom and walked into the kitchen with him walking right behind me. I asked him if he wanted more wine or maybe some water, but before I could grab the water bottles from the fridge, this dude pushed himself up against me and groped my private parts while smiling at me super creepily. This time I was completely taken aback. I shoved him off me forcefully and yelled at him. I told him we had just met and that I didn't think it was the right time to just jump into something sexual. He said I was just a waste of time and said that I had no idea what I was doing and that I give gays a bad name, then said I was being homophobic. I told him that if I was homophobic that I wouldn't be hanging out with him and talking about the way we were. I told him I found him attractive, but that he was crossing major boundaries. He just laughed and said in the LGBTQ community there are no boundaries, and then just like that he said he had to go. Thank God, is what I thought to myself. I walked him to the front door, and he walked out without saying goodbye or anything. I didn't think anything else of it, and decided I needed to take a shower. I got in the shower, and about 5 minutes into my shower, I kept hearing this asterisk tink sound coming from the other end of the door. I peek out through the sliding door of the shower, and look down toward the bottom of the door. To my shock, I see Aiden holding a freaking spoon to the bottom of the door looking in at me while I'm showering. I could only see this because of how high off the floor the door sat. Not knowing what to do, I just pretended to not notice him and slowly turned the shower off. I got out, wrapped a towel around my waist, and prepared to confront him by yanking open the door. Before I could do that, I heard him snap a picture with his phone. I flung the bathroom door open, and he flew down the hall and out my front door. I saw him get into a white Honda Civic and drive away. He had lied about taking an Uber for some reason. I have no idea what the hell took a picture of or why he took it in the first place, but I can imagine that it wasn't for anything good. I immediately blocked him on Tinder and was paranoid that he'd return. So that's my story of the Tinder creep who groped me in my own house. Back in 2019, I am an 18-year-old female, decided to download Tinder a few months after a rough breakup. I was very inexperienced with dating and pretty shy, so it seemed unlikely that I would meet a potential partner in person. Anyway, after a few matches that led to nothing, I came across the profile of someone that I found very attractive, 21 male. We matched, exchanged Snapchats, and continued to set up a date. Our first date was relatively normal/enjoyable. We saw a movie and by the end of it, I felt like we hit it off. However, our relationship was extremely short-lived. Not long after I had agreed to be his GF, after about a month of going out, he began to behave very erratically and would sometimes fall completely silent in the middle of conversation, ignoring me when I tried to ask him what was wrong. He became hot-tempered, slamming doors and speeding on the road when he was mad. I started to feel really uncomfortable about our relationship. This went on for about a few weeks until one night, when we were on our way to have dinner downtown, he fell silent mid-conversation. I became extremely anxious as he pulled into a nearby parking garage, wondering what I had done to upset him. As we parked, I decided to ask him what was wrong. He did not answer. When I asked him again, he shouted at me to shut the F**k up. I was completely frozen for a moment, but I finally got up the courage to tell him we were done, gather my belongings from the car, and walk over to the nearest coffee shop to call an Uber. It was fairly late at night, so I walked as fast as I could, hoping he wouldn't follow me. When I made it to the shop, I noticed I had several missed calls from him. When I made it home that night, I blocked him on all social media and decided to never contact him again. I'm fairly familiar with the dynamic of toxic relationships, and I knew that if he could talk to me that way, completely unprompted, it was likely that he was capable of much more. About a week goes by as I start to settle my emotions a bit. I decide to confide in a friend, who had never met the guy, about what happened, feeling completely embarrassed. A few nights later, I received a text from the same friend. It was a screenshot of an Instagram DM from someone she didn't follow, my now ex. It said something to the effect of, "Hey, I'm sorry we're having to meet like this, but, redacted, is ignoring me and I need to talk to her." My heart sunk. I decided to message all of my friends separately and let them know what happened, just in case. Later that week I started receiving several DMs from various accounts, all without profile pictures or posts. Eventually, I gave in and responded to one, asserting that the relationship was over and that I didn't want to hear from him again. I blocked the accounts immediately afterwards. As time went on without hearing a word in weeks, I figured I had reached the end of the situation. Until one morning while I walked to my car, I noticed something dangling around the handle of my car door. It was a necklace I gave him. He had only picked me up once from my house before. The thought of him driving to my house, about a half hour from his place, earlier that night freaked me out. I was shaken up for a while. It was by no means an expensive necklace, and I had the exact same one. But I kept it pushing. I thought maybe it was his way of acknowledging that we were done. 2 months later, I was working my job at a small boutique near my house. I was used to answering the phone several times a day, so when the phone rang I thought nothing of it. But when I picked up I immediately recognized his voice. He started rambling about wanting a sweatshirt back, but I hung up before he could finish. That was the last time I would ever tell someone I was dating where I worked. I was completely losing it at this point, especially considering he had never called me at work while we were together. I didn't even know how he knew that I was working that day/time. I told my older sister the situation, and she, being very protective, decided to message him herself. She told him to leave me alone, and even offered to give him back the sweatshirt for me. He refused and insisted on meeting up with me in person to get it. When it became abundantly clear that he didn't actually want the sweatshirt back, she threatened him with a PPO, to which he never responded. That was the last time I heard from him. The creepy guy I dated is a murderer. As a teenager, I waited tables in a local restaurant to pay for the gas for my car. I met Mr. Creep there. In my naive mind, he seemed normal at first, despite the fact that he was 20 and wanting to date a 17-year-old. Leaving my job after dark scared me, so I taught myself to get in my car, shut the door, and lock it in one fluid motion. It made me feel safe. One night, I was leaving work and had just gotten into my car when Mr. Creep seemed to just appear out of nowhere, yanking my door handle to try to open it. I looked into his eyes in the split second before he smiled, and what I saw absolutely chilled my bones. I don't know how to describe the evil I saw. From then on, I was terrified of him, but I didn't let on BC I was afraid of what he might do if I told him I never wanted to see him again. After this, he constantly lied to try to impress me and tried to invent ways of being alone with me, but my instinct was to run, so I avoided him. About 2 weeks after this incident, the restaurant got robbed, and there was significant evidence against Mr. Creep, just not the kind that allowed the cops to charge him. I sent all of my text conversations with Mr. Creep.to the police chief in hopes it would help. Mr. Creep slithered away after that, but I always looked over my shoulder. About 5 years ago, he messaged me on Facebook out of the blue. He went on about his top-secret military clearance as well as a huge acreage he owed. It made me nervous, and I felt like he was trying to spring a trap or something, but I tried to put it out of my mind. Then today, I was looking at posts about an unsolved murder when I saw his mugshot. He is now facing murder charges as well as 2 other violent felony charges. I am so glad to know he's locked up, but so overwhelmed about how correct my instincts about Mr. Creep were. I feel like I escaped him. Thanks for reading. So, I'm pretty new to Reddit. This is my first time posting, so bear with me. If this is the wrong sub to post this in, someone help a poor clueless girl out to the right sub to share my horrors with. For a little bit of background, I'm in a wonderful relationship now with a guy I met on Tinder. So this is in no way, shape, or form me shitting on the app, even though the app can sometimes feel like a cesspool. I'm currently a senior at a 4-year university, but this happened in my sophomore year when I was 19. For me, it was pretty hard to find someone to just casually date and get to know since I'm a bit of an introverted individual and wasn't looking for any old hump and dump. I also went through my fair share of abusive relationships, so dating for me was really difficult when it came to opening up and trusting people. When I matched with Chris, not his real name, I was pleasantly surprised. He was a funny, smart, interesting college student with a decent job and good intentions. I enjoyed talking to him, but there was always a lot of anxiety when I spoke with him. I know now that I should have trusted my gut instinct, but at the time, I assumed I was doing my introverted trust issues bullshit and tried to push that feeling away. We would talk a few times a week, and every time we did, the feeling would persist, only each time we talked it would be stronger. He started to make comments about how he wanted me to be his girlfriend, and how he was so excited for me to meet his parents. But we hadn't met and had only talked on and off for a few weeks at this point. So slowly, I stopped responding to some of his messages. Then I started to leave them completely unanswered. One day, I confided in my friends and told them about the bad feeling I always had while talking with Chris. They told me that I wasn't being open to new experiences because I hadn't let go of my past, and that I wasn't being fair to him. So reluctantly, after a few weeks of radio silence and feeling guilty, I messaged him again. After another week or two of messaging and catching up, he asked me to go out to dinner with him. I was hesitant to say yes as my anxiety was through the roof, but my friends insisted that it was just nerves, and it would be good for me to go out with someone. I agreed, and he excitedly told me he had plans to take me to a nice Japanese restaurant in the city next to my campus. My friends were ecstatic and asked to see a picture of him. I pulled up his Tinder profile, and when they swiped through the pictures, they were silent. You know, he kind of looks like insert name of a particularly abusive ex here. I went into a full-blown panic attack. Once I saw the resemblance, there was no going back. There was no way I was going anywhere with this guy. I texted him back the night before the date and explained that I no longer felt comfortable going out and that I was sorry. He never texted me back. That same week, I started getting multiple phone calls every day from an unknown number. They would leave me voicemails that would say things like, "Call me back, babe," or "Babby, where are you? Why won't you give me a chance?" I tried ignoring them, but one day, after getting almost 10 calls, I answered, ready to curse someone the fuck out. I called Chris by his name and told him to fuck off, and was met with laughter. "This isn't Chris. This is Jeff asterisk. Who the fuck?" Chris said I could have you. He started laughing, so I hung up and he immediately called back. I sent him to voicemail. He said you wanted to go out with me instead. He told me what university you go to and showed me your pictures. I'll wait on campus if I have to. I blocked his number, and for a few more days I got a few more unknown calls and voicemails detailing some pretty weird, aggressive and gross shit, but they eventually died down. I don't know if this guy was serious, or maybe it was Chris getting his friend to fuck with me as revenge for canceling, but whatever it was, it had me looking behind me anytime I walked anywhere on campus for the rest of the semester. My roommates and I had a male friend stay with us for a while just in case. I started going back to my hometown on the weekends because I was afraid to stay on campus for too long. It's been 2 years, so I hope that in this amount of time, Chris and Jeff have learned to become better people. Recently separated male, 38, moved back to India and got on Bumble dating app. Married for 9 years, was very rusty as far as dating rituals go. Matched with Priya, female 38. We chatted for a bit. We'd both lived in similar parts of Europe at different times in our lives. We also seemed to have a lot in common. Phone chats before we met. She would talk to me for about 4 to 5 hours a day, with very intricate and disturbing details of what happened in her marriage that did not last long, to various abusive ex-suitors/boyfriends along the way. TW, alcoholism, date rape, non-consensual sex. This was all even before we met. First date in real life. The first date, where we met in real life, went spectacularly well. She came and stayed over with me, at a swanky place that I had booked. We stayed there for 2 days, seemed to have natural ease in occupying each other's spaces. Every midnight the phone, landline of the hotel room, would ring. The third day, I head back to my city, which is only 80 miles from hers. She calls me over the phone wanting to know how far the bus ride to my house was, and casually says, "I love you." I was taken aback, didn't think much of it at that time. This was followed by "in days to come. I want to be married to you. I am yours and forever." Second date in real life. I again head back to her city a week later. Booked a rather basic place, very close to her place. At 1 a.m. she gets a coffee craving. I call the room service to order in, thinking that's what she wants. "No, let's walk to this 24-hour coffee shop a mile away." So yeah, the neighborhood, although fairly upscale, had loads of feral stray dogs on the streets, and many drunken men would come our way, pretending to be lost and asking for directions. She seemed to be enjoying it a lot. We have coffee at about 1:30 a.m. in the night. She again wants to walk back. She takes me to a corner of the road and says, "TW. SA, this is where a date didn't go well, and I was once groped." My legs were shaking at this point. We start walking further. We pass by a broken clay sculpture. She goes, "I have a strong suspicion that this broken sculpture is possessed." I know all about it. My ex-husband's sisters were into witchcraft. We are back at the hotel. It's about 2:30 a.m. We go to sleep. The phone, landline of the hotel room, rings incessantly. Next morning she calls a cab, goes back to her place. I don't think I am ready for a loving relationship yet. I get this text. I head back to my city. I think about this incident a lot sometimes. It just refuses to leave me. I have disturbing fevered dreams about my incidents that she's narrated to me. I am unable to go on dates anymore. It's been 2 months since this happened. Hope I'll recover soon. Recently separated male, 38, moved back to India and got on Bumble dating app. Married for 9 years, was very rusty as far as dating rituals go. Matched with Priya, female 38. We chatted for a bit. We'd both lived in similar parts of Europe at different times in our lives. We also seemed to have a lot in common. Phone chats before we met. She would talk to me for about 4 to 5 hours a day, with very intricate and disturbing details of what happened in her marriage that did not last long, to various abusive ex-suitors/boyfriends along the way. TW, SA. Alcoholism, date rape, non-consensual sex. This was all even before we met. First date in real life. The first date, where we met in real life, went spectacularly well. She came and stayed over with me, at a swanky place that I had booked. We stayed there for 2 days, seemed to have natural ease in occupying each other's spaces. Every midnight the phone, landline of the hotel room, would ring. The third day, I head back to my city, which is only 80 miles from hers. She calls me over the phone wanting to know how far the bus ride to my house was, and casually says, "I love you." I was taken aback, didn't think much of it at that time. This was followed by "in days to come. I want to be married to you. I am yours and forever." Second date in real life. I again head back to her city a week later. Booked a rather basic place, very close to her place. At 1 a.m. she gets a coffee craving. I call the room service to order in, thinking that's what she wants. "No, let's walk to this 24-hour coffee shop a mile away." So yeah, the neighborhood, although fairly upscale, had loads of feral stray dogs on the streets, and many drunken men would come our way, pretending to be lost and asking for directions. She seemed to be enjoying it a lot. We have coffee at about 1:30 a.m. in the night. She again wants to walk back. She takes me to a corner of the road and says, "TW. SA, this is where a date didn't go well, and I was once groped." My legs were shaking at this point. We start walking further. We pass by a broken clay sculpture. She goes, "I have a strong suspicion that this broken sculpture is possessed." I know all about it. My ex-husband's sisters were into witchcraft. We are back at the hotel. It's about 2:30 a.m. We go to sleep. The phone, landline of the hotel room, rings incessantly. Next morning she calls a cab, goes back to her place. I don't think I am ready for a loving relationship yet. I get this text. I head back to my city. I think about this incident a lot sometimes. It just refuses to leave me. I have disturbing fevered dreams about my incidents that she's narrated to me. I am unable to go on dates anymore. It's been 2 months since this happened. Hope I'll recover soon. This happened to me about 1.5 years ago before I met my current girlfriend. You see, even as a male, 31, you can still have creepy experiences. I met a girl on Match.com. We messaged for about 2 weeks and things were going well. I told her about myself and my career, and she did the same, and we decided to meet up. As I wanted the girl to feel comfortable, I asked her where she would like to meet up. She said that there is a local bar that she goes to that she would like to meet up because she knows people who go there. I said that would be fine, and we set a date time. The day of our meetup, she messages me and says that I would have to pick her up because her car had to be taken to the shop. I thought about it for a second and then brushed it off as things happen and I could get all old-fashioned for a date. I asked for her address where she lived and where we were going so I could map it out. She sent me her address and the name of the local bar. I looked up where she lived, and it's in a very bad part of town. I live in a big city in an affluent part of town. I'm not filthy rich, but I have a good career, and I guess with the way I dress, I have to wear a tie and jacket to work every day, and dressing nice when I'm out is the normal for me. You could say I come across as very wealthy. I have a luxury car as well, so I can see why people think that. I go to pick her up, and I knock on the door. She answers and says, "I will be 5 more minutes." I said that would be fine, and I will be in my car. Not to sound snotty, but I felt uncomfortable being in that part of town. As I'm in my car, I see the curtains in her home slightly open, and I had that feeling like I was being sized up and watched. I could tell the curtains were moving because the lights were on in the house. So the girl comes out and gets into my car. We start driving, and she makes comments about how nice my car is, and makes a lot of comments about money, and asking me about the luxuries I must have ECT. That made me feel more uncomfortable, and I just brushed off the comments without revealing anything. We get to the bar and are having a drink, and she keeps trying to pry answers out of me about my wealth. At one point, I asked her why she is asking all of the questions about my personal wealth. She said that she didn't mean to come across as a gold digger or anything like that, but was curious. Now I'm suspicious. She kept texting someone when we were at the table. If you're on a date, that's a bad thing to do. She kept her phone in her lap at all times except once. She set the phone on the table to pick up her drink and look at something on the TV. I saw a text pop up when she wasn't looking at her phone, and I briefly had a chance to look. It said, "Get him back here and get him inside." I looked away, and she turned and snatched up her phone and put it into her lap and sent another text. At this point, I'm frightened and ready to get the hell out of there. I suggested we leave, and she promptly agreed. I don't know why I didn't ditch her, but I drove her home. On the way home, she said she had a good time and asked if I wanted to come inside and fool around. I declined and said I was tired and needed to get some sleep. She was persistent that I come inside, but I kept declining. When we got to her house, I stopped in the road with the car still running and said, "We're here. I need to get home. I will message you when I get home." She said, "You're not going to walk me to the door?" I told her no, and that it wasn't a good idea. The lights in the house were all off, and before they were all on. I knew that if I got out of the car, something would have happened. She reluctantly exited the car, and as soon as the door shut, I sped off. She didn't have my address or my personal number, and I blocked her on Match. Maybe I was overreacting, but I didn't feel safe. When you have that gut feeling, sometimes you have to trust it,